Hello and welcome once again to the Progressions of Consciousness radio program. I'm your host, Keith David Henry. We're here on the Community Listening Network. That's www.clnradio.com. We're continuing in a series we started a few weeks ago called The Nature of Perception. We've gotten into a few elements of perception, and I started explaining a bit last program about the physics behind perception. We started talking about what particle physics has revealed to us about physical matter, and the idea that physical matter exists as a tangible an observable thing because of the act of observation and not the reverse. That is, our observation of our quote-unquote physical world is not based on the fact that it exists, but rather it exists because we observe it. Now, this is a very strange concept to assimilate, because it goes the opposite to everything we've ever been taught about our surroundings, about reality, and about matter. And it kind of makes you understand why these physicists are scratching their heads. I recall when I was working at the University of Penn in the early 1980s, the equipment that I was working on, and it was really, I wasn't an engineer, I wasn't a scientist, I was a technician. And, it was really not very complicated work. The engineers would tell us what components to solder and desolder from the equipment, and we do it. I really didn't understand the electronics of it, but I understood the concept of it. And what they discovered is that within these experiments, and or I should say, a lot of people are familiar with the Hadron Collider in Switzerland, which is essentially a 26-mile diameter tube that's buried underground. And they take these particles and they accelerate them to near the speed of light, and they smash them into each other. That's basically what they're doing. I mean, it's grossly oversimplified, but you get the idea. Well, that's the same kind of experiments they were doing at Brookhaven National Labs in New York. And the equipment I was working on was being used in those experiments. In fact, the printed circuit boards I was working on were part of the detector, the part that actually, gathered the data from what was called the collision, or the event. And the collision was when these particles would smash into each other and explode. And the one thing that's fairly interesting about this whole thing is that an event or a collision was relatively rare. I mean, if you think about random possibilities, mathematic possibilities, and you think about crashes that happen on the freeway, front-end collisions, that front-end collision is relatively rare compared to the amount of cars that are on the road. For those of us who are often stuck in rush hour traffic, especially in New Jersey, we don't consider them that rare. But the idea is they're very rare. Well, think about how rare it is, even if you're trying to get two subatomic particles to smash into each other. So it's a relatively rare event. But when these things did occur, one of the things that had the scientists scratching their heads is they would do these collisions, and they could tell which particle was which by the trajectory that the particle took after the collision. A lot of people, question all of these experiments and say, how can you, talk about these little tiny things that you can't even see, and you're coming up with all these theories based on these invisible things? And to a degree we are, but we're also basing them on science. So, a certain particle, for instance, I don't know, a neutrino takes a certain trajectory, which is straight through the chamber, which is kind of weird, but it registered on the detector, went through all those miles of Earth, and we said, hey, that's a neutrino. Well, how do we know it's a neutrino? Because it always acts the same way. So when we had this collision, this rare event of collisions between particles, the same particle would always take the same trajectory off of the explosion every time. What was odd about it was that, when they reconstructed these particles, they would find in some events there were certain particles missing, and in other events, particles that had not been there previously were all of a sudden there. And what quantum physics is saying, based on these experiments and based on mathematics, is that the constituent particles of atoms seem to be randomly, or at least we think it's random because we haven't figured out any mathematical pattern to it. I'm sure there is one, but they seem to be just disappearing from inside the atom and reappearing. And, if this seems incredulous to you, then you're in good company, because Einstein felt the same way. And he said, look, God doesn't play dice. The universe is ordered. It works a certain way. So I can understand that it's not such an easy concept to grasp or to accept. I recall getting comments from a person with regard to a lot of these subatomic experiments, and they were saying, these experiments tend to be ignoring, I think it was called the Heisenberg principle, I forget exactly, which states that when you use energy to observe a particle, you change the state of that particle. Therefore, the question they were asking is, how can they come to all of these conclusions about the state of these particles when they're using this energy to observe the particles? And there's some basis for that, but realize that these collider experiments, they're not observing the particles, they're observing the aftermath of the collision of particles. Now, I think perhaps it's arguable whether or not again, I don't know if this is the correct name, the Heisenberg principle comes into play. It is quite arguable. But it's really to me, it is not a legitimate argument when it comes to gathering information about the event. So getting back to where I'm going, the scientists discovered, hey, these particles are disappearing and reappearing. And quantum thought is one of the primary purveyors of this type of idea, that these particles seem to be disappearing and appearing. Now, think about what is being said here. What's being said is that physical matter, the constituent subatomic invisible particles that comprise physical matter, are just up and disappearing and going somewhere on a consistent basis. And then they're just reappearing. Now, when you look at solid matter, obviously you don't observe this process. You also don't observe the changes to the matter of those processes. And there's been a lot of conversation about, well, if these things are happening on that subatomic level, one would think that they're also occurring on a macro level. In other words, you could have a guy walking down the street and all of a sudden he just disappears from Main Street and reappears on Jupiter. I mean, that's really, an analogy for what they're talking about these subatomic particles appearing and disappearing. Now, that concept is also, I think, a legitimate question, because, if the individual particles are doing it, why aren't, entire pieces of matter, human beings or rocks or planets doing this? Well, my question is, what if they are doing it, but they have no context in their perception to explain the occurrence? much like what we talked about in one of the previous programs about the shaman who had no context for clipper ships and couldn't see them. So my contention is those things may very well be happening, and we just have no context to explain it, so we don't see it. Our perception is not able to process it because of what we've been taught. Now, I thought about whether or not I would tell you this story because I thought maybe I'd lose some of my audience, but I figured I'm going to tell you anyway because it seems like a good place to talk about it. I recall I was going to visit one of my clients in West Milford last year, and I was driving up Route 23, and I looked over to my right, and there was a couple walking down the street. And I don't know why I was looking over there. I wasn't particularly looking at them, but I noticed, I thought it was kind of odd, because they were on the pavement in front of a strip mall, and there was just grass and everything else. There weren't any buildings. I mean, the pavement was at least 40 or 50 feet from the strip mall. And I just thought it was kind of odd because you don't typically see people walking down Route 23. You know, they're typically driving or they're in the parking lot. So I mean, it wasn't a outer limits type of experience. It's just, oh, that's kind of odd. So the light turned green, and I began to accelerate. And as I accelerated, I passed a billboard that was blocking the view of the pavement. And when I went past the billboard, the people were gone. And I thought, okay, Keith, what is going on here? And I thought, well, you know, I've never gotten high on acid, but you know, if I had, then maybe I'd be able to explain this. So I really didn't give it much thought because at that point in my life, and the way it is now, I honestly don't pay a great deal of attention or give a lot of weight to the things that I see, especially when they're confusing, because I really don't want to, I'm not interested in taking the time to analyze it and trying to figure it out. So this is one of those things. It's just one of those things I put in the back of my head. And as I had about an hour to go on my trip, and I started thinking about the concept that, you know, perhaps people are, you know, just disappearing from one reality and appearing in another one, but it's such a natural process and part of our existence that we don't notice it. Now, I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying the argument, you know, the idea that, well, why doesn't it happen on a macro level, to me is, you know, not a legitimate question. But the point of all of this, the point I'm making is we're still talking about the nature of perception. And, you know, there's a big difference between observation and perception, as I talked about with the example of the 10 people in the room, where, you know, all 10 people see something different. So right now, I want to direct your attention to the website. That's www.don'treadthisbook.net. All right, I'll give you a few minutes to get there. www.don'treadthisbook.net. This is the Progressions of Consciousness radio program. I'm your host, Keith David Henry, and we're on the Community Listening Network, www.clnradio.com. All right, so if you've had time to go to the website, there's a link under the reference and related materials called Perception and the Nature of Reality. Now, if you'll open that link, you'll find a chart to the right, a section to the right that says Video Index. And at the bottom of that list, you'll see a link. Actually, I have to rename that because that's a link. And it says Examples of Optical Illusions. Now, I want you to click on that. Now, for you ladies that are going to be looking at this site, I apologize for some of the material. It's not lewd at all, but it's there to make a certain point, and I promise you I'll get to it. All right. Now, when you open up that, when you click on that link, the first illusion you come to is it's a little drawing of concentric circles, and you have horizontal lines or vertical lines. Now, when you first look at that chart, the horizontal lines appear to be squiggly lines. In other words, they don't appear to be parallel. Now, if you take a ruler or any straight edge and you put them against those horizontal lines, you'll see indeed that they are horizontal lines. Now, this drawing, this graphic, is designed specifically to fool the perception into thinking that those lines are squiggly. Scientists over the years have learned how our minds process information, and they're able to create things like this that exploit, or what I say, explain, that, if you want to call it deficiency in the human psyche, that actually perceives things as different than they are. The thing to realize here is that the mind, or the eye, does not see squiggly lines. The eye sees straight lines. The eye is taking in what is there. It's the perception that sees squiggly lines. But those lines are indeed parallel. That's an example of an optical illusion, and everyone has seen these illusions. For instance, where, if you look closely at the illusion, you'll see all of a sudden a bird flying, when some people look at it and all they see is a bunch of jumbled colors. Well, that has nothing to do with the eye. That has nothing to do with the process of receiving the information through the eye. It has nothing to do with that information being translated into electrical signals and being stored in the back of the brain. What it does have to do with is how the psyche interprets that information. So here you have an optical illusion that is designed to fool you. It's designed to make you think one thing when something else is actually the fact. Now, when people are in court and the officer swears in, the person that's about to testify, he asks, do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Well, the person is probably going to say yes, whether they mean to or not, but the point is, they're going to tell you what they think is the truth, if they're honest. But just because they're telling you the truth doesn't mean that what they observed or what they perceived was accurate. So within that context, if you put a guy up on the stand and you said, hey, do those lines look squiggly to you? He would say, yes, he's telling the truth, but they're not squiggly, they're straight. So this is an example of one of three types of optical illusions that I want to talk about. The first type of optical illusion, or illusion in general, is a type that is designed to fool you. Now, if you scroll down to the second optical illusion, you see another drawing of what appears to be a face or two faces. I was able to make out three faces. There probably aren't any more than three faces. But the average person can look at this illusion, and if they look at it long enough, they'll see three different faces. But most people, when they first look at it, they'll only see one of the faces, and different people will see different faces. So this is an example of a type of illusion where it can actually be more than one thing, depending on your perspective, depending on your state of mind, or depending on your disposition. And it's one of those illusions where you can see many different things. For me, the way my mind works, I tend to be very analytical, and I tend to look at things from many different angles. So for me, this illusion, this optical illusion, is typical to my outlook on life. I'm going to see how many faces I can see. And we're not even talking about making any qualitative state about the faces. For instance, you could ask, well, which face is more pleasant or which face is less pleasant? And that's a whole other issue. But what we're talking about right now is the idea that you can make out more than one thing. So that's an example of a second type of optical illusion that's not necessarily designed to deceive you or to fool you. Rather, there are many or multiple ways of looking at it, and there are multiple things there are multiple properties that can be assigned to it. And if one person says, well, no, there's only one face, you really can't argue with them, because it's a matter of personal perspective and subjectivity. You can't legitimately argue, oh, well, there are three faces, not one or not two. That's only your perspective. So now let's scroll down to the third type of optical illusion. And the third type of illusion has nothing to do with the intent of the person that's creating the illusion. It's just a matter of fact that different people are of a different disposition, and they tend to notice some things to the exclusion of others. And look at the caption in that, what I'm calling an optical illusion. It says a very good optical illusion. If you look at the picture carefully, after a few seconds, you can see a boat in the background. And I also thought this was a very humorous type of example. But, any of you ladies out there that are married or have a boyfriend, well, you know that this is probably an appropriate example. Because, we as guys, our attention is very easily captured by certain things, and we can miss other things because of it. Especially when we're driving down the street, we can miss that there's a yellow line if we're looking too hard and, have an accident. So, you get the idea. So, you guys close that window right now and start listening to me. I will not have a divided attention. All right. So, what do these three illusions tell us about the nature of perception? Well, they tell us that no matter how conscientious we are, and no matter whether or not we agree with the idea that there is this thing called perception that has a great deal to do with what we think about our surroundings, the fact is that dynamic is in place. The problem is that, by and large, we're unaware of that dynamic. We're either unaware of it, or we've just settled on the idea that, look, man, I'm not going to be jumping through hoops trying to figure out life. It's much easier, much simpler for me just to go with what works for me. And I'm not opposed to that. The only problem is when you take that point of view, it can be very difficult to understand and grasp the fact that there are certain interests in this world that are aware of that propensity and that are using it to control the masses to produce a result that they want, using thoughts that they have implanted or conditioned. And they know that the targets of this conditioning are by and large going to think that they are the originators of these thoughts, and that they are their original thoughts, and that it's their life and their choice, when it's really nothing of the sort. Once again, I'm going to refer you to the website, www.don'treadthisbook.net, and in the left column near the top of the page under book information, you'll see a link that says view progressions, a progression of consciousness chart. Now if you're on the radio page of my website, there's a link there also for the progressions of consciousness chart. Click on that link, and I'd like you to look at the second image in the link. Now, in my progressions of consciousness model, I've got around the perimeter of the center circle. Now, in a previous program, I called those concentric circles. I'm sorry that I misspoke. What they are is circles of common diameter, circuits circles of common diameter. They overlap right at the diameter of each other. And that's a sacred geometrical form, which we'll probably get into sacred geometry in a future session of the program, and it's extremely fascinating, because within our discussion of sacred geometry, we talk about the actual process of physical manifestation, which I find quite fascinating, but that's a little bit down the road. All right, so let's get back to these. I've got 12 circles with concentric rings, and these circles represent human interaction with stimuli or with information. So you've got the body and the senses, which I'm calling the body senses, one entity, because they are both objective in the sense that, you know, the body doesn't choose what it's going to feel or what information it takes in. It just takes it in. And the mind is actually what does the figuring or the processing. But, you know, the physical body and the senses simply take in what's there. Then you've got the brain, which is also part of the body, but it's the receptacle. The brain is the receptacle for that information that the body and the senses take in. So then you've got the ego, which is a person that says, you know, this is who I am, this is who I think I am. Ego is a quantitative and qualitative self-image. Contrary to what a lot of New Agers, metaphysicists, and forward-thinking people have come up with, the ego is not a bad thing. It is not something that needs to be suppressed or thrown away. And what we're going to find out in successive programs is that people that are doing that or trying that, if they haven't already figured it out, you're putting yourself in a worse place than the person that is what we call asleep and not awakened, because you're trying to suppress part of yourself that is designed to do exactly what it's doing. Now, because of many things, the ego has found itself in a less than healthy position. And this is something that we're going to address in some later programs, is really how to heal the ego, how to develop the ego, how to right the ego or balance the ego. But we have quite a ways to go before we get to that level. But right now we're just talking about what the ego is. So the ego is who you think you are, who I think I am. It's the one that looks at things and compares itself to those things and makes a judgment about itself based on, cumulative stimuli. So you've got these elements working together. You've got the body senses, you've got the perception, you've got the brain and the ego, and all of these things are working together in a mosaic of who you are and a paradigm or an outlook on life. Now you notice in this chart I've got a label called programming, and in parentheses it says psychic control, and underneath that it says in quotes oligarchical vicarious creation. Now all of that stuff sounds really complex, and somebody said, oh, you could have made it simple, and I probably could have made it simple, but I wouldn't have been able to fit it in that little space. I also presumed or hoped that people would be either reading my book or listening to the radio program where I explain what these things mean. So the programming that is being indicated here, notice what it's pointing at. It's pointing at the perception. So the conditioning in the program that I've been talking about is targeted towards the perception. And it comes under the category of psychic control because it is a way of what I call the dark oligarchy, which is a general term that refers to something that I'll probably explain again in a later session, refers to those interests that are the purveyors of that programming. It's vicarious creation in the sense that these interests have a goal, they have an agenda, and they're carrying it out not by using their own creative power, but by using our creative power to create the things that they want, and all the while making us think that we are the originators of our thought or of our creation. It's vicarious. So the dark oligarchy is using our power to create their world. Now, the question may be asked, well, why are they doing that? Why aren't they using their own power? And the answer to that is they don't have any power. They don't have anything that compares to the grandeur or the sheer scale of creative potential that we as sentient human beings have. So they're using our power because they figured out this mechanism. They figured out how the body senses, the ego and the brain and the perception work together. And they're using that to their advantage to create things. Now, those very simple examples of optical illusion, I hope you can put together how relatively easily almost anyone who wanted to could take advantage of this body, senses, perception, ego, brain relationship to cause people to act a certain way or think a certain way or to have a certain paradigm in life. The other thing that should be clear to you by now is that a lot of these mechanisms that are participating in this programming, this program of conditioning, are not even aware that they're a part of it. For instance, you know, a lot of times they seem to be down on religion, and it's not so much that I'm down on it. If the people, you know, knew exactly what they were involved with, they knew the facts of it, and yet they still wanted to be involved in it, well, now you're talking about something different, because it's really true choice. It's not something that a person has been coerced into or frightened into. It's really a conscious choice. Well, I know what it is, but I still want it. So, you know, we talked about 3 specific agents of programming. We talked about the government. We talked about religion. And we talked about, you know, laws and rules of social orders in general that tend to force us, in a sense, or influence us to think a certain way about certain things. So really, every way you turn and you know, everywhere you go, you're essentially subject to these mechanisms that inherently are designed to really either limit your way of thinking or to persuade you in a certain way of thinking based on the way that this mechanism of perception and ego actually works. And the reason I showed you those optical illusions, and the reason that I'm going here, is because, you know, particularly the first optical illusion, you know, our perception works a certain way. Now, I'm sure I'd be willing to bet, you know, excuse me, that there's certain people that looked at that first optical illusion and said, oh yeah, those lines are straight. Well, what makes that person different? I mean, you know, the lines are parallel. What makes that person different than another person? Well, it's all a matter of perception, for one thing, but on the other hand, you know, now when I look at that chart, after when I first looked at it, when I look at that graphic, I see parallel lines. it's easier for me to see parallel lines now when I first looked at it, because I realize that they're parallel lines. And I realize that it's an optical illusion. As a matter of fact, it's even more difficult for me to perceive those lines as not parallel. It's more difficult for me to perceive them as squiggly and not parallel than it is as parallel, because I know the fact that they are parallel lines, and that influences my perception. So when we start talking about preparing ourselves as architects of the Aquarian age, the first and foremost thing that we're going to have to come to the conclusion of is that, by and large, the way we as a species, as a society, as a country, as a people are looking at things is likely based upon psychic control. It's likely and largely based upon programming. And you don't have to say, well, yes, it absolutely is. But it's in your best interest, and it's expedient to say, I'm not going to take anything for granted. I'm not going to presume anything, because I know that this dynamic exists and has been in place, you know, even in excuse me, even in those instances where it's not intentional. This dynamic is in place that is designed to control my perception, and that certainly there are instances of times when it is intentionally designed to control your perception. Now, I tend to talk a lot about movies that I've seen and use them as analogies. And the reason I like to do that is because, you know, some people are not aware that, you know, when these creative people write these movies, they have a concept in mind that they're trying to relay to the audience, and they use different media. Some people use music, some people use poems, some people use philosophy, some people use, you know, art. Paintings, physical art, and some people make movies. Now, I'm not saying that every movie is an example of art. You know, some movies are just for entertainment. But I believe some movies are literally designed as ways of education and information. But just like anything else, you know, you can't take everything. You take what's relevant and spit out the rest, because again, whatever point they're trying to make in the movie is going to be colored by their own perspective. But one of my favorite movies is called Network. And it was a movie about this guy that all of a sudden had an epiphany about the nature of life. And he figured out that, by and large, the media and what we look at on network news is really an intentional attempt to control the thinking of the masses. And one thing he said was, you know, God forbid that this media of television should fall into the wrong hands. Well, I hate to tell you that, but it already has. And for those of you that are well informed, I don't have to tell you about that. But for those of you that would like more information, once again, I encourage you to visit my site, www.don'treadthisbook.net, and there's a link called Deception in the Media, or Media Deception. And there's a small amount of information there, but if you really want the comprehensive look at it, I highly recommend you visit a site called www.tvnewslies.com, tvnewslies, LIES.com, and you'll find a plethora of information on that. And let me just say straight out that those of you that are watching CNN and Fox News and NBC and MSNBC and even BBC, don't be fooled. You're watching stuff that's being spoon-fed to you that very seldom resembles the facts. Now, I know it's kind of hard to swallow, and there are a lot of people that are saying now, well, hey, where do you get your news? And by and large, I get my news from the internet, and that can also be an interesting proposition because there's everything out there. But that's the true nature of the whole idea of information gathering. There's a bunch of stuff, and you make up your own mind about it. But that's almost impossible when you're only being fed a subset of the available information and being told that that is the fact. These are the facts. In fact, another link. One of the things I have on that site is an interview with Dan Rather. And, he was interviewed after 9/11, and it was clear. I mean, there's so many things about 9/11 that just don't make any sense, the official story. And I'm not talking about if you watch the news. If you watch the news, you're going to be saying, oh, you're crazy, the building fell because of the fire. But if you look at the various scientists and engineers that have evaluated this theory, and you look at it from the standpoint of facts rather than truth, you'll discover, regardless of who or what may have been behind what happened in 9/11, the one thing that you'll quickly come to the conclusion on is that the official story of 9/11 is poppycock. It's blatant misinformation. So somebody's going to say, well, who do you think is behind 9/11? And my answer to that is, it's irrelevant who I think is behind 9/11. The true question is, what are the facts about 9/11? What are the facts? Who cares what I think? Who cares what my truth is? What are the facts about 9/11? So they were interviewing Dan Rather, and he was really speaking to the startling lack of coverage in the mainstream media about the events of 9/11 and what actually occurred. And he was making reference to the tire burning that they used to do in Africa, where when there was someone that was politically incorrect, they would wrap him up in a tire and set it on fire and burn the guy up. And what Dan Rather was saying was that, media reporters or journalists are subject to the tire burning of opinion within their field, meaning that you're really not allowed, by the nature of the business anymore, you're not allowed to probe into and really ask questions about what's going on, because you become ostracized. And today the media by and large is about making money. It's not about getting the story. It's not about exposing lies like it used to be. I mean, investigative journalism is all but dead, because you're only allowed, again I use that word in a relative term, you're only allowed to talk about and investigate certain things and ask certain questions if you expect to have a career, if you expect to exist in the media. So all of this, the influence of the media is just one example. And I'm going to pick on Christianity again, because I feel I have the right as an insider at one point to do so. Now, look, I'm not talking about, I'm going to go visit a church and stand up in the front and say, oh, you guys are all deceived and, what you're practicing is wrong. Because that's not my call. But I do recall, actually, I did preach a message in the church, which was, my last message, where I sort of got down and dirty on things and made certain statements that were not very well received. They weren't profane in any way. They just went against the grain of what people were used to hearing. Again, I'm going to pick on Christianity, and I'm going to pick on religion in general, not just Christianity, but, especially monotheistic religion, because one of the principal unwritten tenements of religion is you do not question what you are taught. You do not question it, period. If you question what you're taught, you are going to be an outsider. And more times than not, the response to your questions are going to be angry responses. And why are they angry? They're angry, probably among other reasons, because you're questioning a person's very important ideals of what they think are reality, and you're inferring that possibly what they believe and hold dear is wrong. And how can you do that when my heart, the person may say, my heart and my soul is so married to this truth, and you're telling me that I'm wrong? Well, the thing about it is, the people that have the greatest faith and really are the strongest in their belief really could care less what anybody says. It's the people that are still developing their faith, if you will, that tend to get angry. On the other hand, the people that have been involved with the system for a very, very, very long time and have something to lose by their little deal being questioned, those people not only get angry, sometimes they get violent. They get violent. Like, there's no more ludicrous of an example to me than a pro-lifer who murders the doctor in the clinic. Oh yes, I'm pro-life. Bang, bang. Well, wait a minute. I thought you were pro-life. Well, I'm pro-life except when I'm killing doctors. So what you've got to realize is that pro-life person, they're not behaving outside of what they believe is truth. But they're labeling themselves as one thing, and they're acting exactly a different way. Now, I'm going to pick on Islam. Maybe I shouldn't, because there might be some radical Islamics out there, and they might have my address. But, humorously, I thought about this whole 70 virgins thing. And the guy goes in the bus and blows himself up. And when he gets to heaven, they're still virgins. Well, what about all those millions of other guys? They get up there and say, wait a minute, I'm not getting any? Well, no, because we got to keep being virgins for the other guys. Well, I'm being tongue-in-cheek here, but, it's the same idea. It's an idealism that if you're astute at all, you realize that it's an analogy and that there's something else to it. I mean, you can't honestly tell me that there were two people called Adam and Eve that ate a fruit and were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. You can't tell me that is not allegorical. You can't tell me that that story is referring to something else that is designed to give you information about who you are. Now, there are people that literally believe that there was this Adam and Eve, these two people that God created in the garden, and that they are the source of all humans, all people that exist on the planet. And there are people that genuinely believe that. And for the most part, if there are any of you out there that were listening to my program, you're probably changed by now, but I'm hoping most people are still listening. So what is the point of all of this? You look at the major advances in humanity that have changed our life. There were always people that had these really, really strange ideas and that were ostracized and treated like aliens because of their ideas. So in our next program, we're going to be getting into some of these ideas that may be considered by most people to be strange. And I'm not asking you to, wholeheartedly and without reservation accept these ideals. What I'm asking you to do is to perhaps consider that the reason they may sound strange to you is because you're not used to hearing them, and you're also conditioned to think a certain way about these things. You're listening to the Progressions of Consciousness radio program. I'm Keith David Henry, and we're on the Community Listening Network. Okay, I want to talk about another element of perception, and it's a perennial issue of male and female interpersonal relationships. And invariably, guys don't understand women, and women don't understand guys. And it seems like, we never will. And I know there's a book called Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, or the opposite, whichever one it is. And I've never read the book, but I've got an idea about what it is. But I do recall a seminar that I was fortunate enough to get a tape of. And there was a guy that was discussing the difference between men and women, and he mentioned that there's actually a physiological difference between men and women, and I found it extremely fascinating. And this physiological difference actually explains a lot about why men and women tend to look at things so differently. It seems that everyone's aware of the two sides of the brain. You have the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. And then there's nerve tissue, ganglion, that connect those two sides of the brain together. Well, apparently, when males are in the womb, the overabundance of testosterone in the bloodstream and in the fluid actually damages that ganglion that connects the two sides of the brain together. And we might call it damage, but this may also be by design, so that men, when they're born, when they become mature, or just in general, when they start reasoning and processing, men tend to use one side of their brain at a time. You've got the analytical side and you've got the creative side. Well, men have a tendency, and again, everyone is different, but this is a generalization that is based on physiology, that men tend to use one side of their brain at a time. And to use the other side of their brain, to go from the creative to the analytical or vice versa, that must be done as a matter of conscious effort, conscious choice on the part of the man. Whereas women tend to use both sides of their brain randomly and indiscriminately, and they're not aware of that process. How that manifests is that men tend to be bottom line oriented and women tend to be process oriented. That doesn't mean you don't have men that are process oriented and you don't have women that are bottom line oriented. This is a generalization, and it has to do with the differences between men and women. And one popular idiom that has been commonly held as a truism about interpersonal relationships between men and women is that men, if they come up with a good rap, then they'll be able to get into the sack. Whereas women will use their bodies, to get what it is that they want from the man, that attention or whatever it is. Again, an overgeneralization. But even, couples that are together or that are married, the guy is scratching his head like, what in the world is she talking about and how did she come up with this? And the woman's saying the same thing. You're on a road trip and you're driving, to wherever you're going. And the woman's like, oh, let's stop here and do this and do that. And the dude's like, look, I just want to get there. Let's get there. All right? Or you're going somewhere you don't know where you're going. The woman's like, why don't you stop for directions? It's like, I know where I'm going. I don't need any help. So women get into the process of things, and men tend to be, well, what's the bottom line? Women can go shopping all day and not buy anything and feel satisfied. Whereas dudes tend to be, well, I know what I want, I'm going to the store and I'm going to get it. See, bottom line oriented. In general, again, this is in general. So which one of the two, the man or the woman, which one is wrong and which one is right? Well, the ideal is neither one. Neither one is right and neither one is wrong. It's just that their perspectives, our perception, our way of looking at things is different. And if we as individuals involved in those relationships understood that dynamic, that doesn't mean necessarily that the outcome of our relationship will change or the issues will change. But what it means is perhaps we'll be a little more patient with each other, because whether or not we understand the other one, what we will begin to understand is that we are essentially different in the way that we look at things, and that the men by and large will never be able to comprehend or identify with the woman's thought process, and vice versa, because of our natures. We'll never be able to reconcile that process. The only thing we can do is say, okay, this is the way it is, and based on that knowledge, we can make the process of collaboration less frustrating and painful. So with the information that we're going to be talking about, I'm not asking anyone to abandon their paradigm or to all of a sudden say, well, I'm just going to reject what I think and accept what this guy is saying or the way he came to it. What I'm saying is start to look at it from, yes, employ your own subjectivity, but just be aware that there may be some underlying processes that contribute to a bias on your part, and be willing to digest it and receive it and maybe research it to see the logic of it. Okay, we're coming near the end of the program. Once again, this is Keith David Henry. You're on the Community Listening Network. This is the Progressions of Consciousness radio program. If you haven't already, I highly recommend that you visit my site, www.don'treadthisbook.net, and also have a look at the series, the Architects of the Aquarian Age series. And you can get to it on that site. Until next week, this is Keith David Henry for the Progressions of Consciousness radio program. Have a great day.